which to me is very similar to being taped because no one is really watching, as far as I can tell. There's a
All right,
chat.
well, okay. We will see if people show up. That's always good. But otherwise, we will just have a good conversation.
Yeah, and at this time it is being recorded. This is our second attempt to have a Twitch conversation, which we could then use for other things. And the last time I didn't have it set up right to actually save what we did. So this time our wonderful faces will be saved on the internet forever for the NSA and others to ponder in future years. But what I want to talk about, I'm going to hold up your book. Um, is Can the Left Learn to Meme? Your book, but I want to talk about it in the context of my own ideas about the avant-garde and radical politics. And your book here is subtitled Adorno, Video Gaming and Stranger Things. And so the way you deploy Adorno to analyze internet culture and the present culture of nostalgia, which is involved in your analysis of Stranger Things, is interesting. And I wanted to just talk about Adorno a little bit and what he has to say to avant-garde artists. Um, I have a quote here from his last essay, Resignation, on open thinking, which I think is a good guide for radicals and avant-garde artists both. But before I dive into the quote, I guess maybe we can just kick back and forth a little bit what is meant by just the term open thinking. Or maybe I'll go ahead and read it and then we can do that. So open thinking points beyond itself. Whatever has once been thought can be suppressed, forgotten, and can vanish. But it cannot be denied that something of it survives. For thinking has the element of the universal. What once was thought cogently must be thought elsewhere by others. This confidence accompanies even the most solitary and powerless thought. The happiness that dawns in the eye of the thinking person is a happiness of humanity. The universal tendency of oppression is opposed to thought as such. Thought is happiness, even where it defines unhappiness by enunciating it. By this alone, happiness reaches into the universal unhappiness. Whoever does not let it atrophy has not resigned. So that's Adorno at the end of his essay on resignation.
It's a beautifully Adornian piece. There's kind of, kind of complex, but it's driving at something very simple. And I think you have to ask with Adorno, is that because he's German, for one? And I think not just literally that he's German, but that his texts were generally translated from German.
I think it might have something to do with him being influenced by the Marxist Hegelian tradition.
And this, yeah, but then that's kind of like you could then ask why were they always so? Why do they appear so complex but yet so clear in their writing? And is there maybe something sometimes lost in translation? But I mean, in any case, it's one of the things that really kind of brought me to Adorno when I was studying. I guess I was 18 or so. Was the power of his writing and the kind of polemic style, which is not so different from Nietzsche, but in a way he uses aphorisms, these kind of short, pithy text. Even when he writes long pieces, things are kind of broken down, so there are kind of these sharp points made every few sentences. But at the same time, it's incredibly complex and can be a bit scary for people. But that's why we're here,
I guess,
and
yeah,
because we've done the reading, some of
yeah,
it.
yeah. So, well, just this idea of open thinking as opposed to maybe instrumental reason might be useful to start with, because instrumental reason, as I understand it, is reason in the service of the already existing, kind of practical reason, or the reason of positivism that accepts what is, whereas open thinking would be free
Yeah,
from the constraints of
I
what
think
is.
yeah, I think this is interesting because it allows us to say something about Adorno's critique of the Enlightenment, and to say that Adorno is not like anti-rationality. It's just for him that the Enlightenment never really went far enough. So there was this kind of idea of developing what we would call a kind of scientific method, to kind of break the control that the church had over people, up to the Enlightenment, but it never really went far enough. So what Adorno finds is that there was this kind of breakthrough, but that this tendency to control people through a system of prayer and worship of symbols was replaced by science using just different symbols, but in much a similar way, that they were using the symbols to control and to kind of box things in, where we as humans are kind of scared of stuff all the time. It's kind of, it's how we proceed. We're scared principally of our own weaknesses and mortality in front of nature, and we try and stave that off by measuring stuff, by giving it names. And Adorno kind of said we need to get out of that, what he would call identity thinking, identifying stuff under inadequate terms. And I guess this open thinking is the opposite of that. Right?
Right. I think so. Yeah. I think that open thinking is certainly the opposite of identity thinking. That would be thinking in service of the congealed ideological construction of the identity. Um, but it's while you were describing this, I also thought about somebody else who was influenced by Adorno and others, but who is certainly not them. Are you aware of the American cultural theorist Christopher Lasch?
I can't say I am.
Okay. He wrote a book called The Culture of Narcissism in the 70s. It influenced Jimmy Carter at the time. He actually consulted with the president about his book, and was partly responsible for a fireside chat with Carter on television, where Carter talked about there being a malaise that had gripped America. Many people thought it was a downward turn in the Carter presidency. It defined a moment where he'd lost touch with people, and he was too negative. But anyway, Christopher Lasch was a kind of cultural theorist, but he became more and more, I would say, socially conservative over the years as he criticized the New Left. And what he would say is that when we strip away people's traditional values, the supports that they have in the face of mortality, say, when we don't allow there to be any immortality project in the culture, we create a society of narcissists, people who can't see past their own death, who are hedonistic, but in many ways the very people that Adorno would rail against. So it seems like in this sort of doubled way, or this dialectical way, we on the one hand want to surpass identity thinking, but we don't want to only negate it. Right? I mean, there's got to be an identity of open thinking. There's got to be a kind of life that one can live as a radical, and that's maybe the aim of socialism. Really, is to provide a life for everyone where they can live as radicals, as free people. And I think that the avant-garde tradition is a tradition that wrestles with how to be that kind of radical. So it's not just a wrestling with how to get rid of tradition, but also how to create an open, radical, experimental tradition.
I mean, yeah, I think really one of the most interesting aspects of Adorno's thought is how far he's really discussing something spiritual, and where he's saying that we tend to we think in kind of in terms of identity. We need to kind of learn to think in the opposite way, which he would call non-identity, and maybe this open thinking is where he's using a different term again. It really makes me think of the writings of people like, I don't know how you say this, Osho, this spiritual guru, Indian spiritual guru,
Hmm.
and many people who write these kind of spiritual texts. And this kind of notion of the risk of being enlightened, that enlightened people can be so far from the everyday reality of most people that they can't really relate to people anymore. And this is like the kind of archetype of the genius madman. Um, and so I get what you're saying there about do we really want to think in a kind of non-identity or completely open way? How can we live in that way? And it's said, or certainly I believe it's Osho. I did some like spiritual reading in my 20s. I kind of thankfully forget a lot of it, but um, he said there are just very few people who have a spiritual enlightenment and then can come back and tell people about it, because you lose any grounding in the language and the measurements and the aspects that govern rational conversation.
Right.
So this is what you're saying. I agree with what you're saying. And then I never thought of it like that. But then socialism is like, you have the kind of experience of something, of a link with a community, of a kind of loss of your edges and kind of feeling part of something bigger. But it's grounded in materiality,
Right.
which I guess what Adorno was doing. He was certainly doing that. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's grounded in a freedom or a materiality that provides you with the support you need in order to be that free individual that sort of the Enlightenment project is supposedly all about. It's only by being connected to the community and participating in it and being supported by it that you can develop into the kind of individual that we supposedly want. But that's more of an assertion than it is a real argument here, because the other way to be individuated is to be situated within a traditional system where you know your place and it's defined for you in advance. You don't have the responsibility of the individual in the of the enlightened individual in that kind of traditional community.
Which is in a way is what enlightenment does, and even leftist politics within enlightenment, that it grounds you in a community. But I think in doing it, it loses the potential for a genuine enlightenment. In that, there's this thing in the Bible, New Testament, I guess. Is said that actually it may actually also the Old Testament, that heaven is coming, but at some unforeseen moment. And then in the Bible it works that there will be an apocalypse, and then there will be a final judgment. But it's coming, but we don't know when. And then I find communist utopia quite similar. It's like you have to go through certain actions to assure it will happen, but you're not allowed to really kind of ask when it's going to happen, or you're not allowed. You have to kind of keep patient and keep in line. Whereas some forms of spiritual enlightenment are much more sudden.
Yeah. Well, it's okay. Well, we can come back to spiritual enlightenment, but to kind of the parallel, just to stick with this idea of religious utopia, or the afterlife as a
Mm-hmm.
parallel to life after the revolution. Um, there's this maxim: Marxists don't create blueprints for socialist utopias, right? We don't map out how the world's going to look and how it's going to operate after the revolution. That's forbidden. The blueprints are bad. But it's very similar, I think, when taken literally or taken uh, in an unnuanced way, to this rule against considering the afterlife in any serious and practical way. Like, there's this unwritten rule within religious communities that when you think about heaven, you don't think very deeply, or at least not in any detail, because once you do, heaven starts to seem wanting. Anything you say about heaven will limit it, and since you're going to try to universalize the experience,
Yeah,
it will turn it against itself. So, for
yeah,
instance,
yeah. degrade it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I remember talking to a religious woman who was in her 80s, so she must be gone now. This is back in the 90s, and when I was on my own spiritual quest, like yours, in my 20s, I did the same thing, and I was asking her, so in heaven, you're going to be with your loved ones and your relatives, and are you going to live in a house? Will you have a neighborhood? And she was perplexed, and she wanted to say she would live in a house, but that also she wouldn't live in a house because whatever house she would get would be inadequate. You can, if you've seen the television show The Good Place, um, they play around with this idea too. Like, they give one of the recipients of the one of the uh, members of the Good Place, of one of the townspeople there in heaven, a house, and whatever house they get will be their house forever, and therefore whatever they get, it will be found wanting. It won't be exactly what they desired. So,
Yeah.
anyway,
I don't know that program, but I mean this.
yeah,
You know.
it's on American television, so it's probably not made its way over. You can watch it on Netflix in the UK.
Okay. Oh, maybe I can find it. I'm in Finland, but I mean maybe I will also find it on Finnish Netflix. But I mean this is it. I mean yeah. I mean Adorno was big into this. Like how does one make material transcendent experience? So his kind of attitude to the artwork is that the artwork somehow can provide a transcendent experience, but that only happens on account of the materiality of the artwork. So basically, what happens is one for Adorno, in the presence of certain artworks which are somehow unintelligible, one kind of loses himself in contemplation. And I think we've all had this. If you imagine like a piece of music, I don't know what piece of music could do it for people today, but I don't know. We all had these experiences. Also, maybe in our 20s or late teens, Pink Floyd. But for Adorno, it would have been not Pink Floyd or anything, or King Crimson, but it would have been classical musicians like Schomburg, Mahler, Gustav Mahler, and in listening to them, because the music is highly abstract, at some point you kind of lose your boundaries because you can't relate to it in any rational sense. And Adorno says that's not really the important moment. Okay, that's something in itself, and that's kind of a moment of awe, almost fear, that he would call the shudder, which I talk about in the book at various points. But he says the really important moment is not that, but that shudder has to end, or rather that moment of transcendence when you're lost in the artwork has to end, and it ends suddenly, and then you're confronted with the materiality of what you're listening to or seeing. So orchestras are composed of people who have instruments that are made of wood, etc. You realize the very kind of tangible reality of the situation, and that the transcendent moment is dependent on materiality and what he would call the truth content of the artwork. And that truth content is precisely dependent on the artwork belonging to the material conditions of society, the relation to production. So there's never actually in transcendence a transcendent moment, and the really important point is the realization that there is no actual transcendence. It's all dependent on material and social conditions. So I don't know where that takes the conversation.
Well, I guess it takes it to art, back to art, and I guess I have some things written down here that I'll come back to as well. The point is that for, let's say, the avant-garde or radical or leftist artist, and let's say the radical online artist today, the point is to try to develop a way to both think and express oneself online that will develop your own open thinking, and allow you to understand the materiality of your own existence that way, and the potentiality to go beyond it. but also that won't be bogged down in the forms of the present, that won't be just merely positivist in its prescriptions.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, yeah, exactly, making art with a view to, you said earlier, individuation, but becoming a subject, but at the same time, realizing this to be dependent on a material and social reality. So this is, I mean,
It's a catch-22 in a
yeah,
way,
I mean,
because
it's
if you must if you want to change yourself, and the only way you can change yourself is by changing your material conditions, then that means you have to participate in a common struggle, politically and socially. But that political and social common struggle will already be determined by the political structures of the society and the material structures of the society you're in. So you're already, you're always already arriving as a kind of subject that you didn't choose. And the whole reason you're setting off on the quest is to change the conditions in which so that you can be free to be responsible for yourself as an individual. And I don't mean like responsible for yourself like growing your own food, but responsible for yourself in so much as you have power and can participate in power in a social relationship in society. Um, so the aim is for society to transform itself. That's the point, because you would be a part of it once you participated in the struggle.
yeah, yeah, I think there's a constant kind of, how could you say it? There's a kind of a conflict between becoming the individual and becoming an individual in a community, and it's very hard to do. It's probably what keeps ruining the left, um, that they don't quite get where they want, because I suppose the right don't even want the community part. They only want to become lots of individuals. So they
Well,
don't have.
I think the differences between right and left is the right doesn't want to change. They simply are wanting to hold on to the community as it is, as they conceive it, and not probably their conception of it isn't even particularly accurate.
Yeah, but they don't have a real problem, because it all comes down to some kind of social Darwinism, I guess. That, okay, well, it's pretty horrid what happens to people, but that's just like the luck of the draw, from their point of view. Or also people, maybe they don't do well because they're just not as talented, or you know um, they're not working as hard, and then when all that falls down, then it's just then again it's just shit bad luck. But people are able to sustenance this if they're rich, or some people are just, that's how they think. I mean, how many people? I mean, you must speak to people who are right wing. Like we will end up with these people in our lives that
Yeah.
that are right wing,
Yeah.
either family or friends that you're somehow endeared to, but actually, they are right wing, and it can be quite shocking having a conversation that there's like a total brick wall that they just totally do think that you know why would they care about immigrants? It's like that's their bad luck. Yeah, okay, but immigrants are in that situation because of what the West did to their countries, and they're like, yeah, but okay, that's like, yeah, it just keeps going. It keeps on like that. There's basically a lack of empathy, I guess.
Right. Well, that I think that empathy has to be built on a universal uh, community, or a universal project, or a future-oriented aim, because otherwise it's just going to be. I mean, I suppose the other basis for it could be traditional religious injunctions, moral codes. And
Yeah,
that works to some degree. Some of the people who are probably best on immigration issues would be certain Christian churches of the liberal persuasion, like the Episcopal Church, or there are liberal Catholic churches. But those people who take it to heart, the do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and the brotherhood of man bit, they will they can be pretty good on these issues, but there's a disconnect between sometimes the religious aims of the institutions and the things that they participate in, and then the everyday members of the flock and the politics of the flock and what they're looking for. Um, but yeah, I mean, when there's no common or universal background to define what's right for us, then it can become every man for himself, right? It can
For
become,
sure, yeah.
yeah.
But this do unto others as you wish would be done unto you. However, this is
Yeah.
phrased. I mean, this is basically Marxist as well. No, I mean this comes from Christianity, and it comes and Kant, and there were pre-Christian traditions who have this. Do you call it the golden rule?
Yeah, the golden rule.
And then this Marxist kind of from each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs.
Yeah, which is not the same thing, right? I mean,
Let me think if it is the same thing. Well, I mean, in a way, I don't know. I would say it's similar because it's saying
it's
like if you have the ability, then you give from your ability to help people who have the need, and isn't that a bit like do to other people as you would like to be done back?
I think there's
Or
more emphasis on equality in the do unto others as you would have them do to you than there is from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs. The equality, there's more of a, it's more transactional with the do unto others as you would have them do to you. It's like, it's reciprocation, an equal reciprocation. Like the idea is, I will treat you well in order to be treated well, or since that's how I wish you would treat me, I will treat you the way I wish you would treat me. Whereas the from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs has the capacity to outstrip that. It'd be, I will develop my maximum capacity to do good, and with the confidence that my needs will be met because others were doing the same. And it's not exactly it's not just it's not as static. Maybe I'm off here, but I think that I somehow feel as though there's a more of a directionality to from each according to his abilities, and also less of an equality or transactional character to it.
yeah, I mean, I suppose it's more systematized.
Yeah, there's also this sort of bit of Adam Smith in it. This idea of the hidden hand. Like, we don't know what everyone's abilities are. We can't map it all out, but we trust that, if people, rather than people pursuing their own greedy interests, but rather if people pursue
Yeah,
the maximization
but
of their abilities, that the world will
yeah,
be.
yeah. But doesn't this all like it all requires? I mean, in the communist sense, it requires an independent adjudicator to understand who has the abilities and who has the needs, and we haven't ever arrived at that adjudicator. It was tried through bureaucratic means in the last century, and I think it's like we're almost waiting for a computer intelligence that could resolve this, that could kind of adjudicate. But without that, we don't, and that could also go horribly wrong. But without that, we don't really have any real way of assuring that a social society would function properly as it should.
Right, right.
The Christian sense is much more spontaneous. It's a bit like moments of enlightenment where you just feel kind of benevolent suddenly, which it almost kind of like accounts for the fact, which is bizarre because it's all grounded in the existence of God, but it kind of accounts for the fact that there isn't an adjudicator, that one is kind of required to become on their own this benevolent being.
Right. Well, my book, which is behind me here on the shelf, Bash Revolution, is all about how to replace capitalism, and I decide to use the science fiction trope of the singularity and the AI in order to do it. But what but I also was trying to implement exactly the from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs idea. But I feel as though we, even to understand what abilities are, we have to have a common or universal value. That we do, abilities in what regard? Like if you think about the intelligence tests, the IQ tests, people will say, well, they only measure a certain kind of intelligence. And that's true. And the kinds of intelligence that they tend to measure are those that are revolving around predicting success in for employees and in educational environments. So if you want to predict whether or not someone will be a successful employee or will do well for you on the job, an IQ test is, not a perfect measure or a perfect way to predict their performance, but it has some predictive ability, and the same is true for educational achievement. But if you're trying to predict other things, maybe goals or institutions or social relations that haven't even been developed yet, the IQ test may have little to no bearing on that. And so, when you're trying to develop your ability, you're always trying to develop your ability in a certain social context. This goes back to the open thinking ideas. Like an open thinking is a thinking that isn't mediated or determined by social pressures currently.
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting. This could bring us on maybe to the internet and
Yeah.
contemporary creative culture in the widest sense. Because if you're trying to make a new society and you're already starting from the point that the old one somehow isn't working, what do we accept as valid and what is not valid? And I think we have this question raised now in a way that has never been raised before. And actually not as a result of trying to create a new society in a literal sense, but just because we have the internet, and that's made this just kind of blown things wide open in terms of abilities and talents and who should be recognized for them. And my inclination, and it's kind of what I express in the book, is that if we think something's not going right now, and if we suddenly have like a mass kind of a mass of free expression in terms of images, audio pieces, videos on the internet, we somehow just need to let them kind of do their thing and see what gets thrown up. So suddenly, and thrown up in like every sense of the word, suddenly the professor, the publisher, the elder are no longer important and almost a hindrance in every sense. And then in my actual life and not in the book, I come into conflict with my own ideas on that level, because you see so much on the internet that's just kind of wrong-headed, and you think, well, there's somehow this on the left. There's we can't do much about the right at the moment, or at least we're left. So let's think about this. On the left, there are kind of some hideous statements coming out in terms of memes and in forums and things, and you just think that, well, maybe this is because the people haven't lived that much, maybe they haven't done the reading, and maybe it needs a bit of guidance. And I feel kind of bad because I actually, because I'm contradicting my own book, but also because I kind of, I think I wish I had the openness, as Adorno is saying, to just let this ride and let these people make their own mistakes, or maybe they won't be mistakes. Maybe it will lead to something wonderful. So
Well,
what do you think?
there's two parts of open thinking. There's openness, but there's also thinking. And a lot of what goes on, in your book, you talk about, we could talk about Duchamp, but also, I forget the name of this person, but there was somebody who was on a talk show, daytime talk show, for behaving badly, like a 14-year-old girl, and she said something like "Catch me outside" or something that became a viral.
Daniele is it Bregoli.
Yeah, and in the book you sort of hold her up as a sort of an icon of a maybe even like an internet vanguard type, like a
Yeah,
new avant-garde type, because she was being celebrated for her lack of expertise, her lack of adequate uh, civilized behavior. She was being celebrated precisely for kind of her failure to come of age, and therefore she wasn't being determined or limited by the social structures of the day. She was outside of that. Is that the right way to think about that?
It's what's her name on Instagram? And her she's now a rapper. Bad Baby, like BHAD.
Mm-hmm.
Bad Baby, and she was on the Dr. Phil show, and he had her on because she was not getting on with her mother. She was fighting physically with her mum. She stole her mum's car. She did all this kind of heinous stuff, and then on the program, I think she was actually arguing with the audience because the audience were laughing at her, and then she said this thing, "Catch me outside." And it's the way it was said, was kind of, I think people found it funny. So she became a meme. And yeah, I say, well, the incredible thing is this young girl, she becomes famous precisely because she can't talk in the kind of, I don't know how this is in America, even if there's like a way of talking, but she doesn't talk. She talks in slang.
We all struggle to master the Queen's English over here in the
Yeah,
States.
but I mean, you could say in England, you could say she's not speaking the Queen's English.
That's what I said. Yeah, the Queen's English.
Yeah,
We
and
know about the Queen here too. At
yeah,
least we know about her English. Maybe we don't know a lot more.
but she's like speaking not even like the president's English. I mean, and that's saying something right now.
Right now, that's really low. Yeah.
Um, and I don't know who was president right at that point, but in any case, um, she was just basically rude, and then became famous quite quickly off of that. And then you could say this is terrible. Like people are becoming famous for basically being bad at school and being aggressive, violent, and badly spoken. But on the other hand, it's like if that can happen, it is the American dream in a sense of anyone can.
Only one thing comes to mind when you talk about this, which is just I want to tell you, don't have a cow, man. But anyhow, okay. That's a Bart Simpson reference.
Yeah, I know. Bart Simpson we know in England as well. Right. I think I'm not even in England. So I think if I asked the Queen, yeah, she might.
The Queen would know who Bart Simpson was.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, whether he would know who she is. Yeah.
All right. So I don't think Adorno would look to her as any kind of revolutionary or anyone to be admired. And I think that. But I think the argument might be that she is doing something that's similar to like Duchamp's gesture with the urinal, right? That she's taking her everyday failure or her everydayness and exalting it and breaking with the power structures or authorities that already exist to determine what counts as mastery. Is that something like that?
Yeah, I think if you take Duchamp, and he kind of said anything can be art, so he would like get objects and present them as art, and you take that and you take Joseph Beuys, who later in the last century said, later in the kind of post-war sense, said anyone can be an artist. So if you take these two things, and Duchamp says anything can be art, but he says the artist has to decide then what is art, but it can be a banal object. And then Beuys says anyone can be an artist. You take these two things and you really kind of give leeway to anyone to declare anything as art, which is kind of what Bregoli did, because she kind of had this argument on Dr. Phil, and then she became a rap artist based on just the kind of comedy aspect of her appearance on Dr. Phil. And yeah, this isn't really Adornian at all. The Adorno aspect comes in where Adorno would say it's all bad, but he was not talking now. He was talking in the up to the 60s, up to 1969 when he passed away, and he was saying that TV, mass media, Hollywood, magazines, this is all bad, and his experience of these things were when he was kind of formulating this was largely in America. He was saying the American mass media is bad because it is very samey. It's all the same kind of ruling class messages, spun to make people stay stupid, but presented as choices. So you could say, okay, I'm going to go to cinema, I'm going to choose this film, but actually, all the films you could choose between were telling you much the same thing in terms of how to live your life, as a kind of pliable citizen under a capitalist system. Um, the thing is now, I don't think we can say that we have that lack of choice in the same way. But of course, there's like aspects in which we're being fed certain messages through social media, but we have way more choice than we had in the mass media era. So Adorno's idea that mass media art, as in like Hollywood films and the such like, can't lead you to kind of useful realizations may not apply when we have so many different options on the internet, and generally in digital culture. And then I wonder that just the complete kind of the free for all, where anyone can say anything, it creates a kind of level of disruption and abstraction, not like what Adorno was talking about when he talked about the music of Schoenberg or the writing of Kafka, but nonetheless a level of disruption and abstraction that could shake things up and maybe lead to realization. So I think Daniele Brigioli, in herself, is not perhaps useful, but the sum part of everybody making whatever they want is somehow useful in its disruptive element.
I guess for me, it goes back to that observation about abilities needing to be themselves mediated or conditioned by something. That, when you talk about a free for all online, um, in fact, the kind of conversations and speech you have online, is free only in the extent that to which it's debased, right? I mean, only to the extent to which it becomes irrelevant. And so the question is, like, how is that different than open thinking? Um, and I guess the thinker has to be aimed at developing his or her own conditions for practical action and for judgment, as well. And whereas I think in online culture, a whole slew of ideological presuppositions dominate, and they're also in conflict with one another. Um, so you can have very sort of crass ideas about, let's just take as an example, beauty standards and how they reflect on a person's character. That you can find all over the internet. People are judging one another based on their looks and saying cruel things to one another, based on those values, which they don't really, which some might try to overturn, but there's no developing universal value online. There's no developing project. It's just a atomized cacophony of
Yeah,
predetermined values.
um, yeah, yeah. I mean, predetermined, though people sometimes do things they wouldn't do if they weren't online. I mean, obviously,
Right.
many of the things that we do online we wouldn't do in face-to-face situations with people. Uh, but I mean, one of the things that really interests me is just, I mean, look, whatever Adorno was looking for, I can't think of a passage, but I can just think the way he was saying that, there's not enough choice, there's not enough interaction, it's all one way. This thing that he kept repeating in his essay on the culture industry, in the dialectic of Enlightenment, which he co-wrote with Max Horkheimer, and it was published, I think, in 1944. Um, surely they were thinking, well, in this case, if things are like over samey and one way and not interactive, what we need is a medium which is more interactive, gives more variety, um, gives more ability for people to make their own statements, and then that is what we have now. But we tend to apply the same critique to the internet as Adorno applied to the culture industry, and as like so many media theorists since him and concurrently with him applied. So I think it's time to develop something a little bit different. So I mean, my kind of answer is that, well, for one, Adorno said that basically there can be no such thing as art in the sense of a creative production that kind of gives people intrinsic value as subjects. That can't happen. He said this at some points in his career from the 40s to the 60s, but he kind of modified this statement. But he said that can't happen after the horrors of World War II, and particularly he tended to say Auschwitz, but he of course meant by Auschwitz the death camps in general. This was summed up in his famous statement that there can be no poetry after Auschwitz, which is often taken out of context. But he's literally saying that in a society that objectifies people to the extent that happened in the death camps in World War II, then we can't really have at the same time an art that kind of spirits people or gives people life energy or something, which was not a word he used. But he did say as a kind of adjunct to that, how would you say adjunct, as something added to that, in the 1962 essay, I believe, called Commitment, he said that we can have no such thing as poetry after Auschwitz, and he really meant art after Auschwitz. Then he said later in the same essay, we have to make art anyway, such that we don't surrender to cynicism. And in a way, I see that's what's happening. Although we have to like be careful to separate ourselves a bit from his historical period, because we're not German Jews as he was, who were dealing with the aftermath of Auschwitz. I don't want to belittle his experience, but we are people who feel we're in a society where there is no kind of intrinsic meaning or value, and that's to do a lot with the media, even new media, the internet, social media. Yet we do carry on making stuff anyway. So we are kind of doing this thing of like, okay, well, basically it's all screwed, but we're going to make stuff anyway as a means to maintain hope. And in a way, that's what millennials are doing all the time, and now Generation Z, or the Zoomers, as they're sometimes called. They keep producing, but they're fairly lost. But it doesn't stop them putting stuff out, which I think is Adornian. But I do say in the book several times that like they're Adornian, the young people, millennials and Zoomers. I don't say Zoomers, but young people, are Adornian in that one respect, which I think one can say, because I think we can appropriate people's texts if it's going to get us out of shit we're in. We're kind of at liberty to appropriate people's text as long as we put the correct provisos, disclaimers.
Well, perhaps, I think this is one of these topics that we should come back to. I want to continue having these kind of debates about internet culture on Twitch, and maybe next time, rather than putting you in front of Andy Warhol's Empire, which was just a still shot of the Empire State's Building for 8 hours, I'll put you, maybe we can play a game. Maybe we can meet in Minecraft next time. Do you know how to play Minecraft?
I don't play Minecraft, but I can start. We can see how we do.
What games do you play? Because we can.
Well, I'm best in terms of that. I'm best at League of Legends, but I don't suppose you play that.
I don't play that, but I'm willing to expand my repertoire. My repertoire right now includes the games I've been forced to play by my kids, which would be Portal and Minecraft and Gary's Mod. Is that a game? Yeah.
Yeah. I have a look at what I've got on Steam. Hang on, because it has to be a game where we can actually simultaneously play.
Yeah.
Which League of Legends would be
I
one.
feel like Adorno. What game would Adorno
Actually,
play on Steam? That's the question we should ask ourselves. And whatever it is, that's the one we should play. I think
yeah.
he would play Minecraft because he's into
But
open.
you can
Have to
teach
be a sandbox game.
you can teach me Minecraft if I can teach you League of Legends another
Okay,
time.
that
This would be
sounds
like an experiment.
yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, anyway, I'm going to end the stream, but it was fun talking to you today, and we'll do it again soon.